Good evening and welcome along to this Sustainable Sheep Systems series webinar, which is funded by the Farm Advisory Service. My name's Hazel Lawton. I'm a senior consultant with SAC based in the Lanark office, and I will be your chair for this evening. So tonight we'll conclude our fourth Sustainable Sheep Systems series, which is centred around consumer-driven sustainability. And we've looked at some topics that are high up in consumer minds and how they play a role in how consumers might select red meat in the future as the population becomes more aware of climate change. So the topics that we've covered so far have been the impact of sheep farming on the climate, where we looked at emissions from the sector. We've covered antibiotic resistance and how reducing antibiotic use on farm has a benefit to human health. And last month we covered the alternative methods to castration and tail docking of lambs to improve welfare in light of the conditions that are looking to be imposed on the conventional rubber ring. I also want to point out that whilst we've had the consumer perception in mind with all of these topics throughout this series, anything that we can do to reduce inputs and improve animal health and welfare is going to have a positive impact on the technical and financial performance of your business. So we're not just fully focused on the consumer. Anything that we can do to improve is obviously going to help our business performance too. Now, tonight we finish with another great topic as we look at ways to reduce purchased protein-based feeds, specifically looking at soya tonight, as its production has a detrimental impact on the environment, and we're looking at growing our own protein sources on farm. So, feeding soya, why is it important and how sustainable is it? So deforestation and land use change driven by agricultural expansion accounts for 23% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. And the main driver for that is the global demand for animal protein. And the livestock sector has been under great pressure to reduce the use of soya. And in 2021, the UK Soy Manifesto was set up. And the purpose of that was to focus on sourcing more sustainable soya. And there's a target to ensure that all soya imports to the UK are deforestation and conservation free by the end of 2025. So looking at where the soya goes, the imports, what industry they head to, this slide's taken from the manifesto website, and it shows that 75% of the global soyabean crop is destined for agricultural use. So it comes as no surprise that the consumer sort of frowns upon the farmer's role in this deforestation and its impact on the climate. So breaking that down, this pie chart just sort of shows what sectors within agriculture the soya is used for. So poultry and fish sectors have the highest soya use within UK, and it's totaling about 1.5 million tonnes annually. So you'll see the sheep is the sort of green sector here. So that's the lowest piece of the pie at using about 30,000 tonnes a year. So whilst that does seem minor in comparison, replacing purchased feed with homegrown sources has also got many other benefits, which we'll cover tonight. So what are the opportunities to make your system more sustainable? And tonight we've got two excellent speakers to answer this question. So we've got Emily Grant, who's an independent consultant specialising in pasture-based beef and sheep systems. And you may remember her from her QMS days, where she did a lot of good work with lots of different grazing groups. She also farms at Kiljockey Farm in Perthshire, growing tup lambs through to shearlings for Innovis. And joining Emily tonight is Duncan Nelless from Thistleyhaugh Farm in Northumberland. Duncan farms with his brother Angus, where they run a closed flock of 1,700 performance-recorded Clin ewes, 750 ewe lambs alongside 260 spring cabin suckler cows. So the farm is organic, it's Pasture for Life certified, and the brothers have done a lot of work with Ram Compare projects, Grass Check, which I believe is now finished, and they're just past year one of the Breed for Change programme. And Duncan will give us a little bit more information about that. Duncan's already featured on the Sustainable Sheep Systems video when Daniel visited the farm back in 2022 to talk about the benefits of terminal sire EBVs. So Emily and Duncan have crossed paths often, and I'm sure they're going to make a brilliant duo act tonight. So without further ado, a warm welcome to you both. So before you kick off, Emily, could you both just give a little introduction, a brief introduction of yourselves and what you do, please?
Yeah. Thanks, Hazel, and thanks for asking us to come and chat. Yeah, so as Hazel said, sheep system here on the farm, growing on Innovis ram lambs up to shearlings, we used to be a breeding partner, so we used to produce rams for Innovis. So, and in the good old days as well, I previously have used red clover to make red clover silage for feeding pre-lambing to use, and also using the aftermath just as the final finishing part for any lambs or cow-stews that were still on the farm in the autumn. And yeah, around about, and I suppose, and just briefly, that one of the reasons I was interested in that is I have a very past life as being an organic farm inspector, and I used to see a lot of organic farms with a good amount of red clover in their systems, and it was like rocket fuel silage that these guys were feeding. So I thought, maybe need a bit of that on the farm. So I'll pass over to Duncan, and hopefully Duncan can carry on and just to tell us little bit more about his system.
Yeah, hello there, folks. Thanks for the invite. As was said, the kind of the overview of our systems is Hazel's just sort of alluded to there. I suppose what I'd say is with my brother and I in this partnership, we've been kind of have a next generation coming on, so we've been quite keen on expanding our business and that. So I suppose what we've ended up with an organic system, and almost by default being pasture-based and pasture for life certified, but it was the economics that brought us there almost, and we've almost ended up in this space simply by having a lot of borrowed money over the last sort of decade, and not really wanting to write too many checks. So we've almost although I know this is about consumer perception and the morality of it, like, but we didn't do this to save the world. We really just did it to try and make a proper living out of farming beef and sheep. So where net margins were very important to us. Now that changes with markets. There's no doubt about it. You know, we're in a very high market value situation at the minute, so the economics of the system we were in might change, but I always do feel that we de-risk the system when we're able to operate in a low-cost system, and we're trying to take ourselves out the vagaries of the market at input end and what we're going to get from going out of the farm gate, and put as much emphasis on our improvement and take as much responsibility for our net margin within our own farm gate, I suppose, would be where we'd start.
So what's the issues? As Hazel alluded to, there's been various issues with, or concerns with using soya, particularly about habitat destruction. But why do we use soya? Why has it become such a widespread part of the animal feed industry? And I suppose, and particularly this is in reference to sheep, but it actually equally applies across all livestock types it's used for. And reality is it's actually a pretty good feed. It's really high in protein as well as energy. It's also really digestible and has really good palatability. So it feels like a feed that's got a lot of wins within it. What are the alternatives? So there's obviously alternative protein sources out there, and others that you may be familiar with are things like distillers grains, although that's obviously a lot harder to get hold of now, and there's issues potentially with copper levels in some of those distillers grains. There's also other products like rapeseed meal as well. However, these tend not to be quite such high quality, particularly in terms of protein, and also they can have a palatability issue, particularly things like rapeseed meals, just not really quite as palatable for stock. And if we see here in the table, so I've just summarized, this came off, it's just information on straits that are available at the moment from KW Feeds. So we can see the top line there, high pro soya, it has an ME of 14, so it's pretty good ME within it, and a crude protein of 53.4%. Now, the column next to it is DUP. So this is really what we call bypass protein. So it's protein that's not degraded in the rumen. And this is really important for livestock production, and particularly at peak times like pre-lambing and lactation. So you'll see there I've put 20%. High pro soya has about 20% of the protein is what we would call bypass protein, not degraded. There are some other soyas out there, protected soyas, that actually that number can be 36%. So I'll explain a little bit more about DUP as we go through, but it's providing a lot of undegradable protein. Rapeseed meal, it's not a bad ME, that's 11.8 megajoules. It's obviously fairly decent crude protein, but not as high as soya, 37.5%. With a DUP, the undegraded part is 11.3. And again, it's not dissimilar. That's wheat distillers I've used in there, but pretty much I think you could apply most of the distillers' grains are decent ME to crude protein, really similar to rapeseed meal, as is the DUP. So soya is a really high quality protein that's available. And with those higher levels of protein DUP, you actually don't need a huge amount to go into the feed in order to supply what you need. However, as Hazel and others have alluded to, partly about de-risking and about having alternative sources is there a possibility for us to grow our own protein to be able to reduce reliance on purchase inputs? So, and the legumes that are out there, particularly red clover, can help meet that need to a certain extent. Okay, so when we're talking about sheep, when do we need the most amount of protein? So there's kind of 3 key stages, really. So late pregnancy, particularly for ewes that are carrying multiples. Okay, so there's obviously lamb growth going in there and obviously setting up for lactation. Then lactation itself, and again, multiples requiring a little bit more protein because although they don't produce quite as much total milk yield per lamb, they're still having to feed 2, or in some cases, people running them with 3. And then we switch from the ewe and move into lamb growth. But obviously there's the lamb growth also to a certain degree. If we've got really good lactation, we're going to have really good early lamb growth rates anyway. So they kind of merge in a little bit, but those are really the key 3 stages that we need protein in the system. This is more a kind of indicative protein requirement. So it's a bit of a mashup of various data that's out there. But really, I just wanted to show you the graph and how it looks, because it's really showing those key times. So to the red dotted line is lambing. So pre-lambing, you can see, so that's 7.5 weeks, 5 weeks, or 2.5 weeks pre-lambing. And you can really see the protein needs starting to build as we get up to lambing. So this is mostly to do with the lamb doing most of its growth and development, and also putting on wool, which has a requirement. And also the ewes getting ready for lactation. So other developments happening and everything that goes around being able to start milk production. But it's really that part as we shift into lactation that you can see, yeah, at peak lactation, there's a considerable protein requirement. So whilst ewes will be out at grass, there's the requirement obviously to be, and to be fair, they'll be getting a lot of that protein requirement from spring grass. It's that ensuring that you're getting that protein level right as they're kind of heading into that lambing period and then into lactation that really sets them up to be producing plenty of milk of high quality. Okay, so the lamb's requirement. So again, this is a bit of a mush-up. So use this data with care, because I did ask ChatGPT, but the data has all come from AFRC or NRC, which is the US and the UK based animal nutritional requirements. But what I really wanted to show here was just, we can see down the column, we've got lamb age from birth all the way through to 16 weeks, what the average, assumed that it's growing at 300 grams a day. So that gives us the approximate live weight. And then we can see this is metabolizable protein. So this is how much protein it requires to be growing at 300 grams a day to be ready for slaughter. That's in at 41 kilos at that 16 weeks. So it builds, obviously the lamb is growing at the same time. So I actually added another column here, and you can see that if I worked it out per kilo of live weight, the protein requirement as the lamb matures actually drops a little bit per kilo of live weight. And this is really because it's done its muscle development, it's done its bone development. You're actually getting to stage once they're close to slaughter that it's actually needing now really to lay down fat. So it's actually energy that it really requires for laying down fat. But that's not to say that it doesn't need protein. But I think it's just, it's a different mix than it is with the ewe pre-lambing and her at peak lactation. So I think that also reiterates those early stages. A lot of that growth is all the way up to 8 weeks is mostly coming from mum and coming from lactation. So this is why it's important to make sure that the ewe is really well set up with good protein in her feed pre-lambing to allow her to do that really good lactation, and we can hit lamb growth rates of about 300 grams a day. Okay, so why has soya been the #1 choice? So as I mentioned before, it's got really high protein content, and particularly this undegradable protein, the bypass protein. So what happens when you feed, the rumen is full of microbes. And effectively, when an animal eats, if they're eating pasture, grass, we're actually feeding those microbes. So the microbes in there will be taking energy and protein to be able to sustain themselves and reproduce themselves. So any protein or energy that goes in will normally be snapped up pretty quick by these microbes, unless there's some form of protection around that protein. Now, if that protein is protected, what happens is that the microbes can't get access to it, so it all passes into the hindgut, which is where the absorption of protein happens within the lamb or within the ewe. So it's a really key part, because if the protein that comes from all the microbes is effectively it's microbial protein. It's made up of whatever those microbes are. But if it's come from a different source, i.e. clover or any other pasture species, then it may be a slightly different protein in terms of it might have slightly different amino acids that the animal can access. So we'll come on to the amino acids as we go through, but it's about that protein not being digested by the microbes and passing into the hindgut where it can be absorbed. Okay. As I mentioned earlier, it's also high digestibility and high palatability. So remember those two key points as we go through as well. Yeah, so the amino acid profile. So the sciencey bit, and I won't go on too long about this because it was sciencey. However, the amino acids, they are basically all the main building blocks of protein. Okay, so they're all the bits that fit together, different, and there's all sorts of different amino acids: lysine, cysteine, methionine, lots of different amino acids. So different amino acids will be put together to make a different protein. Okay. So, but there's increasing evidence to show that different amino acids, and there are key amino acids that can improve production outcomes in sheep, whether that be via reproduction, muscle development and growth, development of the mammary gland, of the immune function, and also really key in fetal development and survival. Okay, so these are core parts of what make our sheep systems profitable. Okay, so just going back those steps a little bit, so it's different amino acids that are required at key times that enable sheep to produce and be productive, really productive. And by having this protected protein going into them, then we're enabling more of these key amino acids to make their way into the hindgut. Okay, and then I'll do one more on this and we can stop if there are any questions. Okay, so New Zealand, there's a lady called Sue McCord, a scientist in New Zealand, who's done some really good research work on this. And in a way, actually, it's slightly, I think, sort of building a little bit on some of the work that John Vipond had been doing as well on protein, and particularly on soya in sheep. So she's done a lot of research looking at some of these key amino acids. So as I said, there's lots of them, and don't get too worried about all the different names, but they're just showing that what the key ones are. So arginine is really important for fetal growth, for placental function, and for muscle growth. Then there's another one here, leucine, which is important for muscle growth and development, weight gain, and other efficiency. And then just even from wider research than Sue's, methionine and lysine is really important for lactation, as are also, which you mentioned earlier, leucine, isoleucine, and another one called valine. Okay, so they're key amino acids which help drive production. So if the protein's protected, the animal has more chance of getting some of these key, which are sometimes limiting amino acids, to be able to perform really well. Okay, so more work needs to be done really to delve deeper in this. But meeting the needs of the animal for the most limiting amino acid is really, really important. And that's what helps drive production for us. So, Hazel, there might not be, because that's quite techie, but if there's any questions.
There's only one question came through so far, and it's kind of going slightly off piece, but is red clover as beneficial for cattle as it is for sheep? So when it's the only question there, we'll go for that.
I'll get Duncan to talk briefly about how they use it for cattle systems, but from the point of view, as we're just talking about this reproduction and lactation, cattle are slightly different because they're not, they have one calf, whereas we're talking about multiples in animals that have small rumens in sheep systems. So sheep are far more sensitive to nutrition to be able to be productive than cattle are.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I think if you're more likely to see it, you'll see it in dairy systems.
Yeah. And just thinking about those amino acids that you mentioned, Emily, obviously undersupply, but can you oversupply? Is there an impact of oversupply, and is it possible to oversupply any of those amino acids?
I don't think there is, Hazel, because I think they would just have to eat so much that it's not possible. Yeah, exactly. Okay. So no, I don't think there is. Duncan, do you briefly want to say how you use red clover for cattle?
Yeah, like you say, we don't really use it in suckler cows to feed them for reproduction. We do graze some of our red clover with cattle, and I'm very cautious, so everyone be cautious about it, because I know that a lot of people have had bloat issues on it. We don't seem to find that issue with it. The stuff we use for cattle is generally a mixed sward. And the cattle, as long as they go on, we've had good performance out of it. But we have used it where we've had almost pure stands of it, and the cattle have been fine in themselves. But I almost think there's too much protein, not enough energy, so it didn't really get the growth of that we were expecting on what looked awesome pasture in our cattle. We tend to use it more in cattle as in making silage to feed R1 steers at the minute, usually to through the winter on it.
Yeah, and absolutely, that's probably where I've seen it used most as well, is just into the young stock as a real high quality silage to feed over the winter. Yeah, absolutely. So what if we can grow our own high quality protein? So yeah, we can. So red clover, and for some reason my clicking, or everything's appearing on the screen at once, so bear with me. This should have just flick through on each click. So can red clover deliver? Yes.
Sorry to cut you off. Just there's a question came through that's quite relevant to what we've just been talking about, pre-lambing nutrition. What quantity of DUP is needed pre-lambing?
It's a really hard thing to work at, like it's really hard to work it out even on like analysis. I think what's important is understanding this, that the protein is protected in here. So the easiest way, and if people are still feeding soy, because the easy rule of thumb just becomes the feed 100 grams per live lamb life, to be able to supply the nutrition that you require. So I think don't get too hung up, because I've tried this even looking at silage analysis on red clover of like actually how much is the undegradable protein, and it's actually quite hard to see it off analysis and things. So I would avoid going down that rabbit hole. I think just the message in this is that we know it works, and we know it supplies really high quality to be able to
this is
supply
it.
them.
The rule of thumbs, the 100 grams,
Yeah.
as Emily says, of soya per lamb carried. But it's mindful, you need to be feeding, that needs to be like 12 ME plus silage. We need to make sure we don't just totally focus on protein. Energy still required as well. So I would always say it's a good idea to contact an independent nutritionist to get some advice for that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
okay,
absolutely.
Emily, thank you. Sorry, I thought that was a
and
good
always
time to
test. And actually, it's an important part just about the silage. I think also just be really careful with silage analysis, because NIR, which is the cheaper silage analysis, might not necessarily give you a completely accurate result off of clover, because it's not. NIR is based on comparing it with average ryegrass, whereas it's obviously not ryegrass. So I think if you are doing analysis, make sure you ask for a wet chemistry. It'll cost you a little bit more, but make sure you ask for a wet chemistry and you'll get a better reflection of really what's in there. Okay, cool. So this is research done, gosh, it was a while ago. I think it was 2004 or something. So down near Aberystwyth. So the effects of feeding ensiled forage legumes on the performance of twin-bearing ewes and their progeny. So basically, this was ewes were fed different silage at 8 weeks pre-lambing. So the choice was they'd used lucerne, they'd used red clover, or they'd used ryegrass silage. So the little table in the middle there, that shows lucerne silage had an ME of 11.1, crude protein of 204, 24%. Red clover had an ME of 11.6 and 21.5% crude protein. And then ryegrass, slightly lower ME, 10.8, and lower protein at 182 or 18.2%. So firstly, as well, I think that's probably a fair reflection of the difference in quality of legumes versus ryegrass as well. You could get a higher ME on ryegrass, but that wouldn't be an unusual analysis to see on most ryegrass silages that are going into use here. So when they worked, all that through the system, the lamb growth rate from birth to 3 weeks was, on the lucerne, 320 grams per head per day. On the red clover, 323. So it's not dissimilar. It wouldn't be statistically significant, but it was different to the ryegrass, which is 282 grams per day. So lamb growth rate was better on those legume silages between birth and 3 weeks. Then when they looked at the lamb live weight at 12 weeks, so weaning pretty well, the red clover, which is one highlighted in red, average lamb weight was 29.1 kilos. Then from the lucerne, ewes-fed the lucerne silage, that was 26.7 kilos, and then from the ryegrass, actually was 27.1. So you can see the red clover was looking a little bit better than the lucerne, so there'd been a slight switch. So the lucerne ended up pretty similar to the ryegrass silage. So that was statistically significant as well. So that was showing that feeding red clover silage was giving you pretty good lamb growth rates early, and also then being able to maintain that as they go through at 12 weeks old. Okay. So the next stage, because remember we're also going to talk about lambs a little bit as well. So same researchers, the effects of grazing this time, forage legumes on the performance of finishing lambs. Now, I annoyingly have a little bit of screen in front of me, so let's just see if I can get it. Yeah. Key points. So this was really post-weaning about putting those lambs on to graze the red clover versus ryegrass. I took out the lucerne because we're not talking about lucerne. And the key thing really was, so this is, as I said, this is post-weaning. Start weights were really similar. But the key things really was that lambs that were grazing on the red clover were taking 40 days to finish versus the ryegrass there at 49 days. And also there was an improvement in killing out percentage. So those lambs were killing on the red clover were killing out at 51% versus the 48% on the ryegrass. So there's kind of a double benefit within there as well. So you are getting more meat yield off of there, but you're also reducing the days to slaughter as we go through. Yeah. So that's for lambs grazing post-weaning. Okay. So why is this? Okay, so this chart's, the only thing that you need to look at here is either the red clover is on the bottom line with the white triangle, and then the ryegrass is sitting up with it's lucerne, and there was another they had another legume in there which was lotus, but don't worry too much of that. It's really just compare the ryegrass and the red clover. And what's really clear is that, so what this chart is showing is NDF, which is neutral detergent fiber, which is the fiber portion of a plant that's really still quite digestible. So it's not the really virtually impossible to digest lignin stuff. It's mostly cell wall. It's the equivalent of, when we talk about porridge, that it's slow release energy rather than like sugar or sugary cereals being high release energy. It's a little bit like the porridge side, that it's slower release. It's fiber that will be broken down by the animal, but it provides energy on a slightly slower basis. But the NDF measure, this neutral detergent fiber measure, is really a main driver of intake. So the lower the number, the higher the intake that the animal will have of that particular plant. So this is because the fiber isn't sat in the rumen for as long waiting for those microbes to digest it. Okay, so we can see there that the lower number there is applying to red clover. It sits just around that, up between 300 and 400, whereas the ryegrass and even actually some of the other legumes in there are sitting a little bit higher up, close up to 500. So we can see really high intakes on lambs, any ruminant actually, or any animal grazing red clover, because it's not sitting in the rumen as long, being digested, so they can actually eat more because there's a much higher rumen outflow rate. Okay, so this also helps if you're imagining, remember we were talking about the proteins and amino acids needing to, or protected proteins, about amino acids needing to find their way into the hindgut. If you've got a high rumen outflow rate as well, you can also increase the chances of that happening. Okay, so, and that's because the diet is so digestible, so it passes through reasonably quickly, ready for the small intestine to be able to absorb the nutrients. Okay, and that's also really important, is that NDF figure doesn't really climb too high in over the summer as you go through. We really see in grass, as it lignifies, as it produces a head, ryegrass will drop considerably in its, its digestibility will increase as the season progresses. So red clover gives us this additional benefit, particularly around about weaning time, when we find that grasses are starting to head and the quality declines. A lot of people talk about lamb growth rates dropping off post-weaning, and often that can be a cause. It's just that actually the diet's not necessarily high enough quality for them, and particularly because they have a small rumen as well. So red clover provides a really nice growth profile, digestible growth profile as we go through the summer too. It's highly palatable. I'll show you another graph in a minute about lamb choice, but stock actively want to eat it. There's heaps of research on this, and it's almost like the number one. If you give them choice, the buffet, they'll go for red clover because they love it. Now, also important is it contains a couple of bioactive compounds. So these are compounds within the plant that help to protect protein. So effectively, this is making the proteins that are in the plant, it's effectively making them kind of bypass protein. Okay, so the two things in there are condensed tannins. So red clover has a higher level of condensed tannin than white clover, but it's not as high as some of the other plants that we see, the other legumes we see that do well, such as sainfoin and lucerne and bird's-foot trefoil can have quite a high level of condensed tannins. And those ones can, and particularly lucerne and bird's-foot trefoil with those high tannins, can be anti-bloat. So it's not quite as good as those in terms of condensed tannins, but there's still some condensed tannin there which will help protect some of the proteins. Then there's also something else in there called polyphenol oxidases, PPOs. So they'll also protect the protein that's within that plant and also protect some of the fats in the plant. So remember, protecting it means that the microbes don't really access it. It's hard for them to access because of this chemical bonding around them. And it means that it's making the way to the hindgut where the animals can make use of them. Okay, so these, when you combine that with the intake as well, these are really crucial, particularly for small ruminants like lambs. They don't have a big rumen, but actually it gives us the capacity to give them a really high quality feed. Okay, and the actual profile of all those amino acids that are in red clover is actually quite good. Okay, so I didn't want to give you all the detail. I don't want to blow your minds with all these different things. And it's actually quite hard to find full amino acids profile. I found one where they're looking at it for actually feeding poultry. Because again, poultry, this is why soya is used in the poultry industry, is just can they, does it have good enough amino acid profile to enable production there? But yeah, generally it does. Plus we're protecting it, plus lambs will eat a lot of it, etc. Okay. So lamb intake rate, work from New Zealand, and they've done a lot of work here. This is their herbal lays where some of their herbal lay work. So there's red clover, ryegrass, chicory, and plantain. Like I said, it's like a buffet. It's like gives them the choice. What do they want to eat? And they looked at that in springtime, and they also looked at it again in summertime when obviously plants change in their physiology as they develop. You know, they'll produce head on the ryegrass, or chicory beyond year one might be heading and things as well. So spring, highest of the intake rate for lambs, grams per minute. Somebody was sat in a field with a stopwatch. But we can see considerably higher than any of the others is red clover being grazed by the lambs. Next in line is chicory. We know it's pretty palatable, as is plantain, and then the ryegrass. Okay. Come into summer, so caveat that this is New Zealand where they'll go summer dry, but even so I think it still would probably be reasonably applicable here. So red clover, yeah, looking still not quite top of the list, but still well up there, 43 grams per minute. Oops, sorry, apologies. But if you look down there, we can see that chicory's actually climbed quite a bit higher come summertime. So the chicory's actually looking like a really good feed. Lambs willing and wanting to eat plenty of that as they go through. But you can see, yeah, ryegrass is least favoured in the summer. And again, that's partly to do with it's a little bit more fibrous, a little bit less palatable as we go through the seasons. Okay. So we'd obviously mentioned a little bit, I showed the graph earlier of the U and just about those requirements. So again, use this data with care, because I had to ask ChatGPT because I cannot find this data anywhere. But apparently it is based on AFRC and NRC, which is the UK and the US nutritional tables requirements that are drawn up. So it's the same table I showed earlier. However, I asked it to say, well, how much protein can graze clover or graze ryegrass provide for a growing lamb all the way through to slaughter at 16 weeks? And so that's those last two columns. If you just have a look at those last two columns, and we can see that, and it's compared to the column that's just before the grey one, that from red clover, we're supplying pretty well just more than enough protein for the lamb to be able to perform, to grow at 300 grams per day. So that's the protein requirement. I've not included energy in here, but that's the protein requirement. And then if we look at the ryegrass column, you can see in red that as season progresses, partly I think, and also just with the age of the lambs and how much they need, is it just is starting to fall. It's not far off it, but it's actually just sitting slightly below what a lamb might require. So again, I think this is really just use that data with care, as I said, but I think it just gives us that suggestion of why can red clover work as a really good lamb feed. Okay. But it's important to note, as lambs reach slaughter, it's usually energy that becomes the limiting factor. Because we can see there that, I remember I said that's why I put the grey column in, is because their protein requirements drop as they reach slaughter, because they've laid down, the muscles laid down, the bones laid down, you need to be laying fat down, and you need energy to be able to lay the fat down, okay? However, when we look at energy and the ME levels of clover, it's actually pretty good throughout the season. So on average, it should be around about the 10.5 to 12 megajoules of ME. So it actually, when you combine that with the fact that the animal has higher intake, we're easily supplying enough energy if lambs are grazing that red clover. Okay. That might be, yeah. That's good. That's a good stop for questions, Hazel, if you've got any.
Yes, we do indeed. Right. So, first question that came in a wee while ago was, is there any impact to sheep when there's a soya with a soybean protease inhibitor? Is that within your knowledge remit?
No.
Inhibitors? No.
And I
thought
think
I was.
It's definitely
because
not in mine.
No, I'm not sure, and I can't remember. I think I should know about it, but I can't remember. And I think, is it not something to do with feeding too much soya? If they want to put down more, then yeah, I might be able to help, but I can't remember.
No problem. If not, we can
Yeah.
try and find an answer. Right. Okay, Emily, you've just got a couple of slides left. Do
Yes.
you
Yep.
want to do your last couple of slides, and then we can have a bit more discussion and bring Duncan in a lot more in establishment and
Well,
management and things?
that's exactly what my next slides are anyway, so it's like perfect timing.
Perfect. Okay, good. If you just want to go for it, Emily, then, and then we'll just
Yep.
have a good question session at the
Yep.
end.
Yep. Cool. So wider benefits, other benefits. So red clover is one of the best legumes to be able to fix nitrogen. So it can fix between 150 kilos and 150 and 250 kilos of N per year. It has, unlike white clover, it has a taproot. So it does have a different rooting system to white clover, but that gives it the capacity to do quite well during dry spells because it's got much deeper root to it. Good yield potential, 12 to 14 tons. Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm going to ask Duncan in a minute if he knows, but maybe not. But I would have thought at least 10 in your system, but 12 to 14 seems to be a figure that's given for the UK. That's off a straight red clover stand, I should say, as well, and it can make good silage. So I'm going to pull Duncan in. Duncan, yeah, how important for you is that red clover and being able to fix nitrogen?
Well, it is important for us in the organic system, but we work with a couple of organic arable farms, and it's a very important part of their fallow period. And obviously, we're paying them for that fallow period on top of that. Just going back to the how we use it with the pregnant ewes, it seems to work really well with them. I would say that it's quite important that ewes go in, not so much for getting up to pregnancy, but like we have fallen foul of them not being in just good enough nick at point of lambing. So we've been doing it for a number of years now, since about 2010, I think, or 9 or 10. So I have made mistakes with it. But generally how we've used red clover, we have to be sure that we have enough good quality stuff to run them in a period. So quite often, up to about 3 weeks pre-lambing, we'll make sure that we had good deferred grazing for them, and then bring them onto red clover at that stage. And then after the lamb, as soon as we can get them onto these arable breaks, we'll get them there within a week of, like, within sort of 7 to 10 days of age, as soon as we can transport them, really. And then so as soon as they're starting to eat, they're starting to nibble the red clover, and they're getting onto that as fast as we can. I mean, the growth rates, we've had fantastic growth rates on it, really, really great growth rates. And like, we're obviously doing the ram compare. There's a cross farm analysis that Signet did as well. So our days to slaughter were pretty good as well. Using it with the ram compare data, we're obviously getting very high genetic merit terminal sires, which would have a contributing factor as well. I do think it's a great thing for maintaining growth rate as well, and it's a lot more forgiving on if you lose control of pasture. So we were able to maintain growth rates, and just on the system, what we tend to do is wean, not we're hoping to get sort of somewhere between 60 and 80% killed off mum, and then but we tend to go to these away keep holdings and bring the ewes away, leave the lambs on their familiar pasture, so we tend to alleviate. Well, we don't, if we get it right, we don't find we get a weaning check at all, really. Just as a thing, because like somebody might ask the question, what's bad about it?
Oh, I've got that to come yet.
Oh, well, I'll not steal your thunder. But
yeah. So when you're talking about lamb growth rates, then, so are you what would be your average up to weaning?
Well, on those ones, we would look to be certainly pushing 400. Well, we'll certainly be slaughtering lambs at 400 plus grams a day.
Yeah.
The ram compare ones were a spread, and I think we were an average days to slaughter of just under 90, 87, 88 across the whole project. We'll have years where we had absolutely flyers, and then a couple of years where, you know, well, 1 year in particular, we just didn't get it right. With parasites, and parasite, that's another thing. That was also a contributing factor, because obviously this is clean arable fallow, so there's no parasite challenge. So all of these like things contribute to the good growth.
Yeah. So I think, although it's clean, I think it's also important just to note, I mean, there is some evidence that the condensed tannins can help. Okay, it's not quite as high, as the condensed tannins aren't quite as high as the really good feeds for anthelmintic benefits such as bird's foot trefoil, but there is some evidence, and there's also like the structure of red clover is totally different to grass. So where worm larvae really need grass to climb up, so just that change in structure can help keep worm burden or worm larvae burden on pastures lower. And certainly in New Zealand, where there's a lot of triple drench resistance now, some farms are just becoming pure, okay, they're using herbal lays, but it's red clover, white clover, chicory and plantain, because that's the only feed that they can give lambs that enables them to not have that requirement for drenching. So there's probably a double whammy within there. So, and Duncan, so when you're grazing, are you rotationally grazing, or are you continuous grazing, or how are you working it when they use?
It is a rotation, but a very it's not an aggressive rotation. So it generally would be 5 to 7 days.
Yeah.
And we don't do it. The farm generally where they are have electric, and they just and it's hard. It's to call it a rotation is probably a bit over-egging it. It's basically half in a field, you know, just to let the clover recover, and then move it up and then bring them back, you know, every.
And do you have a target entry and exit height, or is it just keep them moving? And
yeah, I mean, I suppose you'd would probably want to stay out like in red clover. I mean, where, you know, if you're looking at it, if you're looking at a plate meter, you probably would get a reading of about 2,000 kilos. What it is actually, I don't know, in a pure red clover. We don't want to graze it too hard, too close to the ground. We want to leave it, so we'll become more and more conscious about not. And I think that's why we don't actually rotate actually young lambs as aggressively as we maybe once did, because we find that whether it's the actual case of it or not, but you know, when we've got putting ewes that are ready for a fresh bite on, they tended to go on, fill up with all the good stuff, and by the time the lambs had found their mums again, would maybe just alleviated the benefits of it. So it's not set stocking, but I would hesitate to say it's blue chip rotation either.
Yeah. And how long a rest period would you aim to give it?
Well, this stuff, it's really only it's because it's growing quite hard. I wouldn't like to say what the kilos per day it's grown per hectare, but probably not much more than 7 days when we've got the ewes on, because it's grown at them quite hard.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's one of the challenges with it as well is, but as you say, is at least a forgiving plant that it's harder to lose control on red clover than it is on ryegrass. But because it has these, and it, in a way, that's one of the slight disadvantages is that it's later to start in the spring than your ryegrasses and things. But when it goes, it goes.
Yeah. I mean, that is sometimes we've had, you know, like you. I suppose that might be another thing when we're talking about it, you know, use of proteins as well. You know, one way of reduction might be just to look at when you actually lamb, you know, and we've definitely sort of moved back our lambing dates just to like to be a little bit more forgiving and to make sure we do have that grass in front of them when they're at point of lambing, and I think that's probably something worth looking at. Especially if you're looking to strip costs out of systems, I think it's, you know.
And the benefit to that probably is if you're reducing your days to slaughter, you know, putting your lambing back to utilise that crop.
Yeah.
There's not going to be much difference in when you're selling.
No. I mean,
Emily, that's probably a good point to cover the challenges, if that's all right, and then we'll take a circle back to Duncan to talk about sort of establishment and things.
Yeah. So challenges, short-lived, on average 2 to 4 years. So I think some of the newer varieties coming out of Aber, I think Aber Claret should give you about 5 years. Not winter active, so you need care for your grazing platform. You can't put the whole farm in it because you've got nowhere to graze over the winter. It grows from a crown at just above the soil level, so can be prone to damage, and that's also kind of relates to Duncan's thing about not grazing it too low as well, because you don't want to be damaging into that part, and not really suited to that continuity. You can't chuck a pile of ewes and lambs on it all year and not, you know, all summer and not give it a rest period, because it really needs that time to come around. And risk of bloat, but as Duncan's alluded to, I think most people in organic systems will find that if stock are used to eating it, and used to eating high legume diets as well, there's much less risk, but it's just a cautionary thing as well.
I think one of the things we found, and I really have no idea why some years we have a problem, and to be fair, we haven't had one for quite a while, and I think the farm that we're on started to put things like sandvine and bird's foot trefoil and sheep's burnet into it, was red gut in lambs, and it generally seems to come when you have really high performance. So, or that might just be me being annoyed about good dead lambs. You know, I don't know. But we have had years where we have lost, you know, I would have said not a financially significant amount, but like, you know, where it has been a noticeable problem. But we haven't, to be honest, we haven't had, and I don't know why, we haven't had the problems that we've had when we first started on the system.
No, it certainly gets reported, and occasionally on some herbal lays as well. Again with the high legume content, occasionally lost to red gut. Establishment, and obviously you're grazing some of it on the arable unit, but you're also growing it on home unit as well, are you?
That's right.
Yeah.
So the home unit would use it as a little bit more of an option for silage making, so that generally on the home unit we'll have a little bit of ryegrass in it, and we are putting more and more in the way of plantains into it. Probably less so chicory, but we're still using chicory a bit. Establishment, well, pretty much a bog standard establishment works. We do it under quite often do it under sown spring barley, but it's quite important to get the pHs right, and sow it in a warm soil, I'd say. But we do get quite good use out of it, like, you know, maize sown stuff. By the time we're weaning lambs, we're getting a lot of use out of it in August. And you know, what your dry matter yield was saying, I'd say, we're certainly, I mean, we're certainly cutting off stuff that would grazed, cutting 10 ton, but that was with a ryegrass element.
Yeah, I think it probably will get a little bit more because you get that slight over yielding because the clover is providing the ryegrass with kind of valuable nitrogen. But I think you're right. I think probably around about that 12 to 14 tons if you had a single stand. And now I forgot. Yeah, so what's your target pH, Duncan?
Oh, well, it's just in the sort of high sixes for it, 6.6, I suppose.
Yeah.
And
And are
what
you doing?
about soil type? Sorry, guys. What about soil type? Is there any soil types that red clover suits better, or any soil types that, does it like wet feet? Is there anywhere that you're best to avoid growing
I
it?
think it grows in pretty much anything. I think obviously your the shoulders of your season can be pulled in by soil type. The arable place we work with is pretty good free drain stuff, and it tolerate clover really works well on it because it does stand a dry spell very, very well. On our place, which is
That's
a
not a
bit more.
problem in Scotland.
No. Well, it's like, to be honest, it's not that's on Tweed side, so it's just like a really good farm. Well, there's two really good farms that we work with, and the only thing is they're 40 miles away, so it's an 80-mile round trip every time you want to do something. But like but here on our farm we have we're generally working with a bit more of a clay element in our soil, so yeah, you've got to just be a bit more careful with it. And we have, like I say, we've made all the mistakes with it, overgrazing it, poaching it, and killing it. So it's like Emily was saying, I think you've got to be very careful and about overexposing yourself to it, as a crop, and how much of your actual grazing platform you can actually commit to it. And I know we've always stayed away from it. I know there's a lot of stuff from ABBA saying that it doesn't have a reproductive effect grazing it for mating use, and that's the science of it. We've never done it though. We're able not to do it, so we've never taken that risk.
Yeah, that's Emily. That's maybe a question I'll put to you in, because there's a couple of people. It's one that I've got on my list, and it's one a couple of people have brought up. About the anti-estrogens that can affect young fertility. So, is there any data to support that?
I've just got an anecdotal one here. Like we had we tried it with we pulled some cool ewes back, and onto it, so they weren't too bad, and I'd say it definitely hadn't. Well, with the scanned 100%. But ironically, the ones that scanned in lamb scanned really well. There was just half of them were empty. So it was, I don't know, but so it gave us what was that, 30 odd ewes, and like what was empty was a lot better than when it went on. So it wasn't the end of the world, but it did give us a little bit of I think that just drove us away from trying to do it. But this science is science, so they probably worked that out. This was on a pure clover stand that we did that on.
Yeah, and I think it's on a risk base, because obviously there was AHDB did some work not that long ago actually, which was starting to look at whether or not it was an issue, and actively had farm cohorts that were tapping on it to see if there's an issue, which they found that no, there wasn't an issue. But I think so. A lot of the worry about it came out of Southern Hemisphere, and particularly in Australia, where they were using pure red clover stands, and in summer dry. So when the plant's actually quite high dry matter, that I think there's a feeling that you can actually concentrate some of those estrogens in the plant. And the other thing is, they've obviously been aware of the estrogens, and that being an issue with red clover. And plant breeders are working pretty hard to try and breed these phytoestrogens out of them. So there are some varieties you can get that are low estrogen, and I've certainly had one here because I've got top lambs, so wasn't really wanting to have estrogens here. And in a herbal A I put on, managed to get one which was called Amos, I think, which is a low estrogen version. So things are changing on it. I would still, and it's really hard to get anybody, as I've just not committed to say, just go and top on it. when we had the breeding ewes, we actually never really felt the need to use it for tupping anyway. We would be using that for, as I said, for literally it was the tail end of the lambs, and cull ewes was the final graze of that system. And so that would only have been like 20% of the farm, if that. Probably about 17% of the farm was in red clover, ryegrass as well. It wasn't just straight red clover. So because only a proportion of your unit's going to be in red clover, you don't have to use it for tupping. Just target it for those things that it's, as Duncan alluded to earlier, it's all about de-risking. So target it for those things that you want off the unit, and you can focus on having ryegrass and having ewes in really good condition, and just keep that side of the ewe thing simple by having them elsewhere on the platform. So I think don't worry about it, but if you can avoid, you don't want a bad scanning.
Good advice. Right, Emily, we'll just, if you want to stop sharing your screen,
Yes,
just put
sorry.
presentation off, and we'll go to questions. There's lots of questions here.
Yeah.
We're probably going to run slightly over, but there's merit in discussing some of these questions. Just before I go to some of the questions, one thing, we're talking about reducing inputs and reducing cost. So one thing just for you, Duncan, what's the sort of establishment cost for red clover? What is the seed cost? If we're looking, Mel, in this area at the moment, a sort of high protein, you're spelling going on now.
No, I know. It's
High
funny, like,
protein
'cause,
feed round about here's about
yeah.
350, 380 a ton. So if we're looking at reducing costs in the system, if that's the way we're going, what's the sort of establishment cost of red clover in your system?
Dominic. I don't have that in my head. Like,
Have I
to
caught
be
you off
honest, like,
guard?
I'm a little bit of a one-trick pony. Like, that's what I have a brother for. I would like to say, I really am trying to rack my brains about something coming out.
Emily,
I could
you
just,
get any costs in your head?
no,
It's
I
probably, to be honest, it's probably something I still looked at before tonight.
no, I'm sorry about
that.
that. That should be a one I should have, but I don't have that in my head.
See, as soon as you sign off, you'll remember. It'll come to you.
No, likewise. But for any reseeding program, a lot of the cost is actually involved in getting the seed bed ready.
Yeah.
It's exactly. Although red clover is obviously becoming, like, it used to be pretty niche organic. There were not many people using it before, but it is becoming a lot more fashionable. Because of herbal olays, particularly south of the border, because there's a lot of funding for GS4, etc., and also for dairy units, because they're starting to see the benefit of being able to reduce nitrogen inputs but maintain lactation as in with it as well. And I think some of the other, when you speak to some of the plant breeders, or some of the issues they have is that because they're breeding this plant for production, for leaf production, it's not for seed. The reality is that these plants actually don't always produce very much seed. And there are specific conditions that you need to produce seed. So I know there are some years that it's quite hard to get red clover seed, because weather's not really played ball, and they're not always particularly high seed yielding. So red clover's not quite as cheap as it used to be, is what I'm going to say. It was a short version of what
it's a high value feed with many benefits. Yeah,
exactly. And like I said, a lot of the cost is in getting that seed bed ready.
Yeah. Perfect.
I'm
right,
trying
we're
to
going
find
to
out here, but like I might know by the end of the talk.
Right, we're going to go for a bit of a question marathon. So if we can try and keep the answers quite brief and just try and get through as many people's questions as we can. So you've sort of answered, when red clover sort of starts and stops growing, we know when it's most utilised. But to get the most out of a bit of ground, is a ryegrass and red clover mix a good compromise? So Emily, we'll put that to you first.
Yes, I think so. You obviously wouldn't get quite the full benefits that you would of a full red clover stand, but if you're planning to make silage as well, I think it does help, because one thing, although the clover has quite a good ME content to it, it's actually lower in water-soluble carbohydrates, so the sugars. So if you are planning making silage, there's a definite advantage in having ryegrass in there, because they provide the sugar, so you get much better fermentation, and it's easier to wilt as well, if you've got grasses in there too.
What about if somebody's got a, a permanent sward, permanent grass sward just now, and thinking about stitching in some red clover just to increase that for silage? Is that a good shout? What's the success of sort of stitching it in?
We haven't had very good success with that.
Right.
I think if you weren't organic, I think the people who can use a glyphosate to put it into without a cultivation will probably get away with that quite well if they have a fair wind behind them. But we haven't had any success with that really.
Okay.
I think, Hazel, if you're spending the money on red clover seed, I think, and on any reseeding program, I find it hard not to incline to say, yeah, do either spray off and kind of direct drill in, or plow and establish.
And give
It's
it the best
really
chance.
hard. Yeah, it's really hard to put any other legumes or herbs into an existing grass sward, because their growth is too competitive to enable those seedlings to fully develop before you need to graze.
Yeah. And this is it for MD thinking about doing that. Obviously, PSF funding for soil analysis has returned for 2025. So do make sure you soil sample first and make sure the pHs are right. Right, okay, a couple of comparisons here between different clovers. So what's the protein difference between red and white clover? Obviously white can be a bit more persistent. So what's the protein difference between those two varieties, Emily?
My understanding, white clover can actually be a little bit higher. So I think I did write it down, a little note card, and left it downstairs. I think the red clover is probably about that 16 to 21, 22% protein, crude protein, whereas the white clover is kind of 18 to 24%. But as I said, they're slightly different. And also the plants actually are slightly different, as you've alluded to, Hazel. That white clover is more persistent. It's equally grazed well by stock. They love it as well. But yeah, they're there or thereabouts, a little bit more protein. But don't forget, we can probably supply sufficient protein off the white clover. Sorry, off the red clover. So, but yeah, we don't necessarily need to worry. But white clover will last you, and it's still an awesome feed. In a ryegrass white clover sward is still a really good feed for lamb production if you manage it well.
I mean, we quite like using white clover as well. I think the arable places, I know you might know better, Emily, but the perception is that it doesn't deliver the nitrogen that red clover does. So that's quite
it's less. Yeah, I think white clover is probably around about the 150, whereas red clover is the most generous legume out there in terms of building of the amount of nitrogen that it can fix and then supply. Which is, as you say, it's why it was common. It's commonly used in arable, particularly organic arable rotations, to build fertility.
So when we're talking about nitrogen, the next question on the list here is when you're finishing lambs on red clover, is there a cost to excrete the nitrogen when protein supply is too high?
There will be. We don't find it a problem in finishing lambs, but like I said, I think with limited performance in finishing cattle by having them on high legume legume swards, lambs seem to be able to. Whether they're just growth demand of them at that stage, they can use it. We haven't found a problem with that.
Okay, so what sort of age of cattle, Duncan, would you?
Well, these would be R2, so we'd be looking at them at about between 14 to 20 months.
Yeah.
And we put them on when we put them on, we were thinking, and there was always a little bit of a worry about bloating them, which didn't become an issue, but it just looked like they were going into paradise, and we thought we had a good year for finishing lambs. This was at home. We can't really send cattle away there just for facilities, really. And yeah, it was a little bit disappointing when they came off, because we were expecting,
high expectations.
We had high expectations for growth cattle. Yeah,
and it's funny when you mention bloating cattle. I don't know if there's any Yellowstone fans out there, or if either of you watch it, but when people speak about bloat, I just picture this episode of Yellowstone where somebody's chucked clover out a aeroplane, and it's the next morning there's hundreds of cattle dead from bloat, and it's just one thing that sticks in my mind. Anyway, that's going off piste. Another comparison. So what's the difference between red clover and crimson clover? And is there a place for crimson clover in a sheep system? Emily, do you want to have a go at
Yeah,
that?
so crimson clover is an annual. So the year that you sow it, depending when you sow it, so if you sow it in the spring, as soon as it flowers, that's it, done its job, and it will not survive. Okay, so it'll produce its seed, and that's it, finished. That's its life cycle done. If you autumn sow it, you should be able to get it most of the way through the winter, and then it's not particularly frost hardy. So, not that we're having particularly hard frosts in Scotland at the moment, but generally I would aim to lose it within that first winter by kind of January, February. So short-lived, red clover, 2 to 4, maybe even 5 years out of it. So those, in short, are the key differences. But if you want a short-term fix, I quite often put crimson clover in as part of a nurse crop for establishing swards. Also because these annual clovers will fix nitrogen in their first year, unlike the perennials take a little bit longer to do that.
Okay, thank you. Couple of last questions for you, Duncan, just in your system, and then we'll probably need to draw the questions to a close. Is it a pure red clover stand that your ewes and lambs are grazing, or is there ryegrass within your sward?
The ones that we're really trying to finish quickly are generally pretty much a pure stand, though we've started to, like I was saying before, we've started to use well, the farm started to put in sandfine and sheep's burnettas in it, and sometimes bird's foot trefoil. But like you'd be pushed to see it when the red clover is going at full crack.
Yeah.
So basically there's no ryegrass element in the arable system. They're an organic arable system. They don't want grass.
Yeah.
So that's pretty much a pure one. We use on our home place, we use a little bit, quite often put a little or put ryegrass in it, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
The high inclusion of clover is like 30%, or like really high. That's really high, and you would see nothing but clover at that.
Yeah. Good.
Certainly in the until later on.
Excellent.
Just briefly on that, Hazel, if I could, is
Yep,
we used to put it in with so we never had it as a pure red clover stand, but we would have ryegrass, and we also put white clover in as well. So eventually all that would happen is your red clover disappears out the system, but you've still got ryegrass, white clover for years 5, 6, 7, and 8 if you don't want to have that short rotation. Obviously you don't get quite as much red clover out of it because you've got those other plants in there. But if you don't want to do that shorter rotation, then that can work.
We found that pretty successful as well, actually, inclusion of white clover, and it does extend your rotation.
Excellent. Yeah, that's good advice. And Duncan, how, we spoke about, obviously you're not tupping ewes on the clover. How long pre-tupping do you remove them from that sward? When do you take the ewes off? Is there a specific period that you work to, or?
Well, just on advice that were picked up early on, we just look at 6 weeks clear of it.
Right, 6 weeks before tupping.
Yeah, and just to throw another spanner in the works, though, we do have ewe lambs and we're made 650 ewe lambs, and we've taken them closer, and they've took fine on it. So, we're just.
You're never tempted to go closer and closer and closer.
Well, yeah, but very much so sometimes. But like, yeah, it's just. I think as time goes on, and like there'll probably be a little bit more work done, and we might have a bit more confidence to do that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But it's not something we need to do at the minute, so we don't run the risk. That's all.
Okay. And final question for tonight is around the protein content in the silage. So, Duncan, sorry, I've maybe missed this if you've mentioned this. What sort of protein contents are you getting on your red clover silages?
It's usually, as long as it was sort of north of 14, we were all right, but it was usually better than that. It's usually about a 16, 17, and as long as it was kind of at least getting up to 11 and a half ME, we were quite happy, as long as the ewes were in good nick, to run up to point of lambing with that.
Right, okay. And then, so the actual question really is from the member of the audience, what's the secret to getting those sort of higher proteins on the analysis? The best that they have achieved is 15%.
Yeah.
So to get in excess of that, what's your secret? Or is it the luck of the draw?
I think it is, because we've been down to 14, but we've been over fit. We've had 16% and 17% stuff, and that is just must be luck of the draw.
Yeah, there's no
Because
management
we ain't
changes.
great at that. Usually because we're grazing at early season, so we were taking in effect a second cut, even though it wasn't really grazed and then cleared and then let go for silage. So that maybe helped in that it was a like almost a second cut with a lower inclusion, so the ryegrass wasn't as high inclusion on it when the red clover was really a bigger part of the analysis. But I think energy is a really important part of it as well.
Yeah,
Having the high ME is quite important.
Yeah, we used to make 2 cuts as well, and so first cut normally around about kind of late May time would be higher ME, lower protein, because the ryegrass is more active in that part of it. And then the second cut around about August time would be higher protein, lower ME. So you get a really nice mix and match to be able to kind of balance a diet for use with that.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you very much. We'll just end the questions there because we're a wee bit over time. But thank you very much, guys. I think the two of you have done an excellent job of selling red clover tonight. I mean, Duncan, some of your figures are absolutely fantastic to hear. You know, your target is 60 to 80% of your lambs, you know, sold straight off their mothers. Growth rates of 400 grams a day. You know, these are just fantastic, and I think it's something that we should all be aiming to look at, is getting that performance and getting those gains. The quicker we can get lambs grown and sold, that's the target, isn't it? Especially with the prices that we've got just now. Let's get them away. And Emily, thank you very much. That's been a really good in-depth overview of red clover. Really good stats there. Some of it quite a high end and technical, but really interesting to hear those things. So no, thank you both for your time tonight. So that draws the 4th series of the Sustainable Sheep Systems to a close. And I would just like to thank the audience for joining us.